Hi, and welcome back to Reading with me, Lauren from a Martyrs Learning Centre in Johannesburg. We have been reading for a couple of months now, almost every single day. And if you're joining me, welcome. This is my favorite part of the day. We have just finished reading book 1 of the Chronicles of Narnia, which is called The Magician's Nephew. And as promised, we're moving on to the second book, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But I'm not going to read from this version because as I turn the pages, it's quite an old version. The pages are popping out. So I need to do some book repair. But before I do that, let me see when this was. This one was actually published. This book was done in 1980. My gosh, this one's old. No wonder it needs a bit of repair. So I'm going to read from my newer version, which is exactly the same. And we're going to start at the beginning like we normally do with chapter 1. And if you've been following me and reading with me, no matter which book you've been reading, you know that we finish the books. You know that we read approximately 20 minutes. We read every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday live here on Facebook, even though we're morphing a bit to YouTube, but stick with us for now. And we normally read a chapter at a time, depending on how long the chapters are. And this one, if you haven't read book 1 with me, you'll know that at the end of book 1, if you have read, you'll know. If you haven't read, let me tell you. At the end of book 1, Diggory and Polly come back from Narnia, which has just been created, and they have an apple with them. And Diggory's mom eats the apple and she becomes well again. And they plant the core, and the core turns into a tree. And later on in the chapter, the tree falls over with a storm, and they take Diggory, who's older now, takes the wood from the tree and builds, and he's a carpenter, and he builds a wardrobe. So that was sort of the lead-in to this amazing story. And this is the most famous of all of them. It was made into a movie, but I suggest you read with me because it's beautiful. I'm going to read, quickly before I start, I'm going to read a letter that C.S. Lewis wrote to Lucy. And he says here, "My dear Lucy, I wrote the story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis." So he wrote this book for his goddaughter, Lucy. And chapter 1 is called Lucy Looks into a Wardrobe. So it really kicks off with some excitement right from the start. So let's get going. Where is my bookmark? I love using my bookmark. It helps me with reading fluency. Maybe that helps you. Chapter 1, Lucy Looks into a Wardrobe. Let's start. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. That'll be World War II. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife and had lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names are Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man, with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs for the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen at our feet and no mistake, on our feet, and no mistake, in other words, they're kind of lucky," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." I think he's an old dear, said Susan. Oh, come off it, said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. Don't go on talking like that. Like what? Said Susan. And anyway, it's time you were in bed. Trying to talk like mother, said Edmund. And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself. Hadn't we all got to go to bed? Said Lucy. There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here. No, there won't, said Peter. I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between. What's that noise? Said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. It's only a bird, silly, said Edmund. It's an owl, said Peter. This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a terrific place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks. Badgers, said Lucy. Foxes, said Edmund. Rabbits, said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. Of course it would be raining, said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor, and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. A long, low room with windows looking out in one direction, and two in another. Do stop grumbling, Ed, said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so, and in the meantime we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books. A wireless is a radio. Not for me, said Peter. I'm going to explore in the house. Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare rooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armour. And after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner, and then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle in the windowsill. A blue bottle is a fly? Nothing there, said Peter. They all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, and even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. Sure, this is really an old book because people don't really do fur coats anymore. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed their face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it was very foolish to shut oneself in any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be simply an enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder if those are more mothballs, she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went on a step or two further. Next moment she found that she was rubbing against her face and hands. What was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it is just like branches of trees," exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there between the dark tree trunks she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she was set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it was a very silly thing to shut oneself in a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. "I can always get back if something goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood towards the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamp-post. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamp-post in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamp-post. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of the forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as if he'd been doing Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. Oh, that is the end of chapter 1. I wonder if we should read chapter 2. Let's see. Oh no, that goes on a bit. Okay, we're going to have to go into chapter 2 tomorrow night. But that's the start. So how quickly did we get into Narnia? So exploring a home, this old home of of this professor, and they found the wardrobe, and Lucy went in, and as she was going through the fur, she got sort of further and further back in the wardrobe and never got to the end of it, and then suddenly there was snow, and she's in Narnia, but I don't think she knows about Narnia. So tomorrow night, chapter 2, what Lucy found there, we'll have to see what she figures out. And there's a couple of really interesting photographs. So here are some photos for tomorrow's reading. So even though it is a public holiday, I do hope you come back and read with us, and I hope you enjoyed the very start of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Bye-bye.